Oh, welcome and thank you for letting me talk to your group. I took over the winter finch forecast last year from Ron Pitaway, and I will be talking a little bit about the art of how this is done, try to give you the most update information on a lot of these winter finches, how they've been moving. And let's start. Second here. Okay, the origins of the winter finch forecast. Ron Pitaway started in 1999 and did it for 20 years. The first few years, it was an evolution of how he was going to set up the format and that, and it was very localized for Ontario. And then 2003, as more and more people were very interested in it, it spread to more Eastern North America. And over probably the last 7-8 years, it's become much more of a North American event, still more based Ontario, Eastern North America, but Northern Minnesota, you're still part of the Ontario sphere there, because we're a very big province. It's looked forward greatly by birders. When I took it over, I knew a lot of Canadian birders were looking forward to it. I didn't know how big it was in the United States. It is, found out minutes after I took over from Ron, it was posted I was the new finch forecaster, how huge it really was. Species of trees that we sample. There's several species that we sample that have various effects on the different species, like mountain ash berries. If they're a big crop, it has a big effect on Bohemian waxwings and pine grosbeaks. The primary drivers of the finch movements in most of the boreal forest is white spruce, black spruce, tamarack, and the birches. White birches, yellow birches, the alders, and some black alders out west. These other species have lesser effects, but some species like eastern white pine and red crossbills, they have a good link there. Maples, ashes, other berries, both grosbeak species will be on them. Red cedars is more of a Bohemian waxwing food source. The primary drivers of the eruption, you can see species on the left and various cones on the right where they line up with. Species like pine siskin and white spruce is one of the main drivers, but they are like the Swiss Army knife of finches. They will eat a lot of trees, cones, and birch seeds and insects. They're very versatile. Other species like the white-winged crossbills, the two white spruce, black spruce, and tamarack are their primary, almost exclusive source in the boreal forest. When they leave the boreal forest, they'll hit hemlocks too, but that is a big driver for their movements. 3 species, the evening grosbeak purple finch and pine siskin, they all eat various cones and seeds, but their big driver for their population is spruce budworm, which we'll talk a lot more later in the talk when we go into these species. But their populations seem to be on the increase because of the massive spruce budworm outbreak in Eastern North America. How we rate the finch forecast for the cone crops. We have people of various levels and skill levels, from very beginners on trees to actually forestry profs who give me extremely detailed notes on each tree. But for this, we try to have these 7 points here so we can get people across North America can supply as much information as possible. And it goes from none, as no cones, to very poor, a few cones, up to average, good, many cones, excellent with lots of cones. Bumper is where the branches look like they're going to break off the tree. They're bending over so far. If you see tamaracks with bumper cone crops, you can actually tell it's a bumper cone crop when you're driving by at 40 miles an hour, because tamaracks have very weak branches and thin branches that they will be bending heavily on a bumper crop. In 2019 in James Bay, southern James Bay, we had a massive bumper crop of white spruce, especially tamarack. So much for the tamaracks, they haven't recovered in Eastern North America in the last 2 years from this massive bumper crop. I was doing work on shorebird monitoring, that's where tens of thousands staged in southern James Bay in Ontario on the seacoast there. But every morning we were having hundreds of white-winged crossbills coming in, passing by, and some would stop with their young that just fledged from some other place in the boreal forest. They brought the kids, dropped the kids off. The male started singing, the female started nesting again, and they're having their second or third nesting of the year. because the food source was so huge. White-winged crossbills would go 2-3 times a year breeding if the food source is there, even in the dead of winter. 2021, the seed crop, well, it's North America, as you probably in northern Minnesota could smell. A lot of the boreal forest west of Lake Superior in Canada was on fire this year. We had approximately 6,000 forest fires between Thunder Bay and British Columbia and the coast there. These fires are going with, we had widespread drought from probably about an hour and a half west of Lake Superior in the boreal forest, all the way into British Columbia, up into Alaska. With these widespread droughts, we had widespread forest fires, very intense forest fires, and we had record-setting temperatures. There's a town in British Columbia, the interior, where one day it hit the Canadian record of 48 degrees Celsius, which is 121 Fahrenheit, sorry, 119 Fahrenheit. The next day it hit 121 Fahrenheit, setting the Canadian record again. And on the third day, it burned down from a forest fire. Places up that do not get high temperatures over 100, like the Northwest Territories, Yukon Territories up near Alaska, and way up northeastern Canada and Labrador, hit over 100 degrees this year, which is unheard of. Plus, with this drought, extreme heat, and the forest fires, there's several insect infestations. Primarily, the one that is the big influence on winter finches is the spruce budworm, which eastern Canada, primarily the province of Quebec, has had a massive one. It's a 40-year cycle, and this last 4 or 5 years has been on a big increase. I'll discuss those a little more. And just north, across the border in northwestern Ontario, there is a jack pine budworm outbreak that is a fair size too. That's providing a food source for these finches. This is the boreal forest from far east of the island of Newfoundland all the way to Alaska and almost up to the Arctic Ocean coast and down into the border states. I have surveyors who I send out requests for information in midsummer, and in August, people start sending me information what they see. These are all the locations that we had for surveyors. Primarily, it's an Ontario thing, but we have more people in New England, maritime provinces of Canada, some people in the upper Midwest. I hope this talk, I can enlist some more people. The more information, the better. And Western Boreal, we have to add on more people, and Northeastern Quebec, we would love to add more people. So it's a coast-to-coast bi-national survey with all volunteers. And if without you guys, we do not have this survey. Last year, the excellent white spruce crop was from International Falls area, Minnesota, all the way up into Alaska through the Western Boreal Forest. East of that, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, Newfoundland, the cone crop, except for one tree species, was absolutely pathetic to non-existent for so many tree species. The only tree species that really had any kind of food source in terms of cone crop was eastern white pine. And one species, the red crossbill, really keyed in on that. But a lot of the east, that's why we had the super flight. A lot of these birds came out, from breeding and started moving around. They realized there's no food, and they had to fly south for survival. This year, it's different. This year, the belt of food is in the east, hugging the Duluth area, just really close to Lake Superior, from Lake Michigan eastward into Newfoundland. In southern Quebec and south central Ontario, there is a huge amount of food, and most conifers, birches, and alders have so much food this year compared to last year's absence. So a lot of birds have moved into here from the west and from the north. Now we'll start talking about some of our many lovely winter finches. This lovely one, a male white-winged crossbill. The species is the nomads of the boreal forest. They swing back and forth across North America, this huge population, like a pendulum. If the cone crop is in Western North America, they go west. If it's in the east, they go east. The estimated population of Ontario is 5 million birds. The Canadian population is 33 million birds, with Alaska and some northern lower 48 population, it's about 35 million birds, approximately. White-winged crossbills, last winter versus this fall, they did something. Last winter, you can see them in these eBird markings. The red is recent for anyone who doesn't know. The blue is more than 30 days. And each mark represents, could be one bird, could be 1,000 birds. That's the one issue with, when you look at eBird markers, you don't know how big the population is in that marker. Was it one sighting of one bird, one sighting of more? But here, last winter in the east for white-winged crossbills, the food crop was non-existent. A lot of these birds were flying for their life. It was that they had to find food or they were going to die. But what man did is we have planted, here's Quebec City, Montreal, the city of Toronto, Boston, Halifax, and Nova Scotia. In these urban areas, there are a lot of exotic spruce trees. Norway spruce, blue spruce, Engelmann spruce, Sitka spruce, various exotic spruces that don't belong there. Those exotic spruces within the cities had a cone crop. So the white-winged crossbills, when they were moving around, they moved and keyed into these cities. And in the Boston area, there's a pine tree, called Japanese black pine, that's planted along the coast that had a cone crop. The crossbills that were in the east that didn't realize to go west, they flooded into these cities, and they were just trying to find any food whatsoever to survive. This year, however, in the fall, they're all over the east, from Lake Superior eastward all the way to Newfoundland. What happened is in late June, early July, when the heat and the drought was forming in the west and there wasn't much cone crop left, the birds, huge amount of white-winged crossbills, got up and just flew straight east and southeast across the boreal forest into this belt of food in New England, southern Canada, and towards Newfoundland. They arrived in July. I have reporters, cone crop reporters from Newfoundland that said, yeah, they showed up in early July, and by August we had chicks. And some of those birds that were in Newfoundland started flying back in October, back to a place right here I've referenced several times called Tadoussac, Quebec, where they have a big flight migration site. They were getting over 20,000 one day, over 20,000 white-winged crossbills coming back this way into this area of food after breeding further to the east. As you see, this is another map of last winter, early spring. They were in these urban areas in Duluth, just trying to survive on cone crop. And then once the cone crops that were in the wild trees and this belt of food started ripening, the white-winged crossbills just poured into, basically from Duluth eastward, into big numbers, enjoying the cone crop. The ones in the west, a large percentage of them went straight down into the Rocky Mountains and coastal ranges looking for food. This is the current white-winged crossbill map as of 2 o'clock this afternoon. You can see on the white-winged crossbills, there's a really thick line on the shore of Lake Michigan and a thick line on Lake Superior. You'll find a lot in the big picture. It gives you a good view of which way the birds are coming from. A lot of these birds were coming out from the northwest where there were droughts. They hit Lake Superior south of Thunder Bay, and they don't want to fly. Finches do not like to fly across water. They try to avoid it when they can because they're diurnal migrants. So when they're flying during the day, they're open target for merlins or gulls if they try to cross the lake. So they hit south of Thunder Bay and went down southwest towards Duluth before swinging around. And other birds that came south of Duluth went straight towards Lake Michigan and hit it. The birds that were north of Thunder Bay, they went straight east all the way to Newfoundland. They just moved, and some swung around the lake in the northern parts of Michigan. This is a birder biasing. The white-winged crossbills, as I said earlier, they were in urban areas, Ottawa, Toronto area. That's where they stayed last winter because there was no food in here. This year, there's lots of food in the forest, but there's not a lot of markings of observations except for this one little line coming through here. This is the highway into a very famous park in Ontario called Algonquin Provincial Park, where most birders go in the winter to see the winter finches and boreal chickadees. It's almost our equivalent of Sax-Zim bogs for people from Toronto area to go see it. So all the bias, there's a big birder bias of people birding in that corridor and not birding anywhere in these forest locations here, but there's lots of finches in these areas. That's one thing you have to watch out for eBirds. Sometimes it's a bird or bi, so people go to one spot. This is another species, the red crossbill. This one this year was a really good guide for telling me where the belt of food was. There's approximately 175,000 in eastern North America. There's a few types. It's a type 1, which is Appalachian. Type 8 of Newfoundland, which is very rare. Most of them, what we see here in Ontario, the Great Lakes area, Minnesota, are primarily the type 10 species. They have different call notes. Matt Young, the president, the founder of the Finch Network, is a huge red crossbill fanatic, and he has all these recordings. And if you have any recordings, he would love to have them. So in 2020, when in the east, where all these winter finches were pouring south, the red crossbills knew there's food source in the white pine, eastern white pines, and these areas are concentrations of where there were white pines. Up here in east of Superior, there is no white pines. There are extremely few, if there is any left, that weren't logged. But they found where the white pine crops were, and that's how they stayed over, made it through the winter. Red crossbills in the summer didn't have many white pine crop, but they had this belt of food. And you saw the map earlier about the belt of food from Newfoundland around Superior, Duluth, and back. The red crossbills during the summer were already in there before I even did the forecast. They already figured out where they wanted to be. And now they're still mostly in the belt, but some have gone roaming around to urban areas. And this is the Appalachian population that don't really move too far. They enjoy their hemlocks. But if you can, on years where there's poor cone crop for other species, if you notice there's a good red pine or white pine crop, keep an eye on those stands of pines for red crossbills. You can see last year, they were all around in the eastern white pines that were in the Upper Peninsula, Wisconsin, Minnesota, northwestern Ontario. This year, the red pine isn't a crop there, and it doesn't have crop, but there's more food around, so they're much more scattered across. Pine siskins, these, for last year, they threw me for a loop. I thought I had them pinned, but then they pulled something on me. The species is the Swiss Army knife of finches. They love their white spruce, but they'll take the birch seeds and all that, and they'll happily take insects. Last year, I was getting reports from cone crop reporters saying there's huge numbers of pine siskins in Manitoba, northwest to Alaska, and I was getting very little information on Ontario. With COVID, a lot of researchers couldn't go to Northern Canada, and a lot of the First Nations didn't want outsiders in because of limited medical resources. They didn't want to have any outbreaks there. So a lot of these areas where these pine siskins were in northern Quebec, northeastern Ontario, where the spruce butterworm outbreaks, there were a lot of pine siskins sitting in there. They're feeding on the insects, on the budworm caterpillars, but when the caterpillars became adults and then laid their eggs, the pine siskins with a tiny little bill can get into the needles to get those egg cases. So they'd eat on the egg cases, and then the newly hatched caterpillars in September, they were sitting there in August, they were sitting there eating them. When other winter finches started moving early because they didn't have any food, tens of thousands of pine siskins were sitting in spruce butterworm outbreaks quite happily, making it, I was quite oblivious to them. They were the surprise last year. And you see that compare the fall last year, there's a huge push that went down south. And this year on the right, they're scattered much less. This is on eBird. The light pink is a lower percentage of checklists in that block that have reported pine siskins. The darker the purple, the higher the percentage of checklists that have pine siskins. And if it doesn't have a pink or purple block to it, there was no pine siskins reported to that area. So last year, they pushed down all the way into Florida to Mexico, to New Mexico in huge numbers. So much so, if anyone watches feeder cameras down from Delaware all the way across to New Mexico and Lawson, Texas, you see these feeder cameras, wall-to-wall pine siskins having a great time in the winter. Up here on the border states in southern Canada, there were pine siskins around, but there weren't very many, and they tended to be stuck in feeders. This year, a smaller movement in the east. Most of them are still around the border, but out west, with the drought and the lack of food, they have streamed down big numbers down the coastal mountains into California, and in the Rockies down into New Mexico and Arizona. And some, like the white-winged crossbills, have left the boreal and have gone into the plains just trying to find anything. Now, the common hoary redpoll, I don't know if anyone's heard, but they've done some genetic work on these two species and plus another species called the lesser redpoll, and they found out they're all the same species. Their difference is controlled by one what they call a super gene that gives them the characteristics to be look more hoary or more common, be more resistant to the winter. Excuse me. So these little charismatic finches, in winters where there's not a good tree crop, like last winter in eastern North America and more towards the central upper Midwest and western North America, if there's not a good tree crop, they will happily go out in the open fields, and they love weedy fields. If you're out there and you know they're around, and you find a really good weedy field like this and you don't see them, go drive, get a coffee, and come back and park your car and look, because they're probably still in the field. They're just down feeding. They'll get up, fly around for a bit, and disappear back from the fields. The common versus the hoary. The common has a darker red on the breast, darker striping. The bill isn't pushed in. The hoary looks like its bill's pushed in. They're really white and frosted, and the whitish rump. Hoaries are more of a northern bird. They're more common redpolls will be on the northern edge of the boreal forest up into the subarctic. Hoary redpolls will breed well up into the Arctic on sparse little dwarf willows. These two species are charismatic survivalists. They can survive the dead of winter where it's minus 40, minus 50 in the winter nights in northern Canada in the boreal forest. How they do it is they will, in late afternoon, they'll dive into the snow. There's no freezing rain up there yet, thankfully. So the snow's nice and light and fluffy. So they'll dive into the snow and they'll make tunnels up to a foot long into the snow to sleep under the snow for the winter for the night to avoid the cold temperatures. The University of Alaska did a study on trying to figure out how tough redpolls were. So I don't know which year it was done. I think it was probably done a while ago, because I don't know if animal welfare would allow you to do this now. They basically try to freeze them to death. And they found out that common redpolls can survive down to minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and hoary redpolls can survive down to minus 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So yes, without even the snow, they're built, these tiny little survivalists are built to handle the cold weather. You'll find them when they come to feeders, you'll see it looks like they just gorge and then they disappear. They are gorging because they have a pouch that comes off their esophagus, which they can jam full of seeds when they're on a feeder, and then fly back to the tree cover or the shrubs out of the wind and stay warm and digest all those seeds. This is the common redpolls last winter. They were all throughout the Midwest, but in the east, Michigan eastward, there was a huge amount of them. There was no food for the redpolls coming out of northern Quebec and Baffin Island, and they came down and they had no food until they got to the agricultural fields, and they were in the weedy fields. This winter, they're here in the east, but they're not in weedy fields. They're all, since we have a good birch and alder crop, all the redpolls that are around are in much smaller flocks, a lot of times mixed with goldfinches, and they're all in treetops of birches and alders feeding on those seeds. I have not seen one this winter in a weedy field. This year, since we had the drought, we had a big push of redpolls. They came in, hit Superior, stacked up in Lake Michigan, or they went over and shot and went towards the Atlantic. You have a lot more redpolls, looking at your bird, there's a lot more redpolls in the upper Midwest, all the way to the Plain States, and a lot of them the flocks are much bigger than they are east of the Great Lakes, and they're a lot more, they're in the weedy fields and taking advantage of the weedy fields and the seed sources in the open, like they were doing east of the Great Lakes last year. This is the eruption last year. Redpolls made it down to New Mexico. They made it to the upper Gulf states, but from Lake Ontario here through the St. Lawrence Valley here, they were so dense. They came in until they hit these weedy fields and open agricultural areas, and they found these weeds and they just stacked out there, or found people's nitrogen feeders. This is what it looks like currently now. If anyone heard with watching the Finch Research Network page or watching the Cone Crop Facebook page, there's lots of talk about Tadoussac, Quebec. Tadoussac, Quebec is right where the arrow is. They had 260,000 common redpolls come by in November, and they were all heading southwest. What we figure, our hypothesis is, from looking at, again, the northwest side of Lake Superior, the western side of Lake Michigan, a lot of these redpolls came out of the drought and no food in the western boreal forest. If they went north of Lake Superior, they pretty much came straight across, hit the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and then turned down into this belt of food. The ones that went south of Thunder Bay, along Lake Superior, into Michigan, or into the open areas of the upper Midwest. Detroit, Michigan seems to miss out on all these big finch flights. They get bits and pieces because they're surrounded by the lake. But a lot of these finch reports, when they're getting 25,000, 15,000 common redpolls, are heading southwest. A lot of birders here in Southern Ontario, New England, all that, were like, oh, we're going to have tons of redpolls. The redpolls hit the belt of food with the millions of birch in all the trees full of seeds, and they have basically stopped in there. This is Quebec City. They had, in their Christmas bird count, I think they had close to 3,000 common redpolls. 2-hour drive away in Montreal, their Christmas bird counts, very few redpolls. Redpolls are all up in here having a great time on the birch. Hoary redpolls, discussed a little bit in the east here versus the west second. There's more hoary redpolls that seem to be in the east reports. They line up again, but in these open fields just on the edge of the forest. Hoary redpolls tend to come down further in bigger numbers when there's a huge common redpoll eruption. Last year, we had a huge common redpoll eruption, and this is just the common redpolls, the hoary redpolls from one winter. We had more common hoary redpoll records in eBird in one winter in Eastern North America than we had period since eBird were started. They just came down in big numbers and they visited feeders. It was quite a good little show before they just all become redpolls. This is eBird's all-time records. I apologize for the lettering not being the clearest because this is so many records I want to show. This is the scattering of all eBird records for hoary redpolls. Again, little bits on the lakeshore, but they're scattered in the across, lost in the fields with the common redpolls. This is just the redpolls for this fall, this winter. Yes, there are some in Quebec, very few in Ontario. Most of them are from Winnipeg down through Minnesota, a little cluster around Chicago. They're here where you are, Sax-Zim bog. You have the highest concentration this winter of hoary redpolls in the east. You have a big flight of common redpolls, so the hoaries have come in with the commons. Easiest thing to see them when you see a big flock of common redpolls moving around, look for that frosted Bertha who's just been dipped in snow. Then key in and look for the white rump, the pushed in bill. Purple finches. Well, we're on to. These are birds in urban areas, probably not so much up in northern Minnesota, but more southern Minnesota and in southern Canada and in border states southwards. This species gets mixed up at people's feeders with a slightly similar house finch. A lot of times people think they see purple finches, they get sent a picture in, it's a house finch male. The males look like they dipped in raspberry, but they still have that nice dark line. And the females have that really nice dark eye stripe and much darker spotted breast. And they're slightly bigger looking than house finches. On the right here is last summer. This is where they're breeding, and similar, Manitoba across to Newfoundland, right on along the border area, the lower boreal forest. Last fall, there is no food in the east, and they pretty much evacuated Canada. You in Minnesota area, the Dakotas and all that, you had more food, so more birds stayed out there. But you can see here through the Gulf states, even into Florida, they had a huge eruption of purple finches that came out of the northeast, went southwest. They even started flying in late August. We knew something was up when we started getting interesting numbers in late August instead of mid-September. And they came down and they erupted and stayed down there. And us in Eastern Canada, we missed our finches because they were down enjoying the south. This is the difference between last year and this year for purple finches in the upper Midwest. Both years, there's this band that comes across through Minnesota towards Milwaukee where they like to stage. But this year, there's more food up in northern Wisconsin and parts of northern Minnesota, so there are more birds scattered across this area. This species, like the pine siskin, will move right out of the north in bad food years, and good food years, some will move, some will stay. It's almost like a personal preference. Now this is lovely, the pine grosbeak. This is a bird that does not want to leave the boreal forest if it has to. It can happily survive on eating tamarack buds and spruce buds in the dead of winter. This is one species that totally keys in heavily on mountain ash berries. Last year in the east, we had a good flight. We were getting reports from Manitoba eastward of a pretty good mountain ash crop, but not many other berries, period. What we saw was it appeared that the black bears ate a lot of mountain ash, then the robins and the swings and thrushes bulldozed whatever berries they could find as they moved south in the fall before the pine grosbeaks even left the upper parts of the boreal forest, higher latitudes, and started coming south. Because when they came south, they couldn't find mountain ash. So they showed up in a lot of towns eating ornamental crab apples. This is the one right-hand side, our current winter. This is usually the average extent of where they'll drift in. Most of these are small flocks or individuals. Around Superior in the boreal forest, Ontario, Quebec, they're bigger flocks. This center part of Ontario, Quebec border is quite a few good-sized flocks. Last year, they came much further south. Again, at Tadoussac here, Quebec right here, they had a big flight of them. The St. Lawrence River at Tadoussac is 15 miles across. The finches don't want to cross it. So all these finches that are coming out of Labrador and northern Quebec, where there was apparently no food crop, they came down the St. Lawrence, and as soon as the St. Lawrence River got narrow enough at Quebec City, it's only about a mile wide there, they poured and went straight south into New England. People in Vermont, Massachusetts, New Hampshire absolutely loved it. They'd go to the bank, and in the bank parking lot, these ornamental crab apples were just full of pine grosbeaks. Myself over here near Toronto, we saw these numbers, hoping they would come. No, as soon as that river got narrow enough, they poured south. This year, the berry crop from Thunder Bay eastward is bumper in some areas. Some branches, I heard in Quebec, were breaking from the weight. But still, at the same time, they were at Tadoussac, where they have so many berries, they were still getting white-winged crossbills passing through. It almost seems like the first waves of each finches leave the food up there for the later waves. They're quite considerate, it seems. They say, okay, we'll go further, we'll eat further, we'll let our brothers and sisters who come later have this. This year, this is as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, this is the current pine grosbeak situation in the upper Great Lakes, up Midwest into Manitoba. Again, the red is checklist within the last 30 days. There's lots of birds scattered throughout this area. Sax-Zim bog is densely in there. From about here eastward is lots of mountain ash and other berries. This way the crop drops, and you can see a lot of these pine grosbeaks have come out of the forest and are in urban areas around Winnipeg and various towns here. There's not a lot in the forest in northwestern Ontario. These are all Dryden town, Sioux Falls, Sioux Lookout, and Kenora, where these birds are sitting in. In the east side, there's food all over the place, and talking to people who give me information from up here, they're like, yeah, it's not a hard bird to find in the forest this year in the winter. They're all over. And if anyone watches the Cornell feeder cam for Ontario that has lots of pine grosbeaks, that is its location right there. Now we'll talk about my personal favorite finch. It's the evening grosbeak. Way back, I grew up in the 70s, and this was an expected bird in my backyard in the winter. In the middle of a city of 100,000 just east of Toronto, it was common everywhere. The evening grosbeaks, they used to be just a western bird, and then they figured when man went out, these Europeans went out and settled in the prairies and all that, they were planting box elder for windbreaks. This species is one of the species that love to eat box elders, and there's a theory that they followed some of the box elder eastward in the winter and stayed. And then in the 70s, we had a huge outbreak of spruce budworms that lasted close to 20 years, which this population exploded through during the 70s and 80s. Evening grosbeaks, during a big spruce budworm outbreak, up to 80% of their diet during breeding season will become budworm caterpillars. They absolutely gorge on it so they can have successful nests and large clutches. Then the budworms in the late 90s, sorry, the 90s and mid 2000s, the spruce budworm outbreak basically collapsed in most of North America, and this population was on a fairly steep decline that in both Canada and the US, it is special concern. However, I'll explain more of this in a few minutes, but there's a big spruce budworm outbreak that's been going on for about at least a decade in Quebec, now in Ontario, and parts of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and this species is responding and increasing. This is the current distribution of most evening grosbeaks. You can see this huge population in here. They're in the belt of food because there's various food sources and berries and seeds and many bird feeders, but also this is in a close proximity to the major spruce budworm outbreaks. This is currently to the west, much less because there's a lot less food. The evening grosbeaks in northwestern Ontario and in Manitoba have basically moved to feeders. Your area here has a nice little concentration. This little pocket here in Michigan, they don't move. They're there every single day, it seems. I don't know what they like, but that population is always stable there. This area here, there's been a jack pine budworm outbreak for the last 6 or 7 years. There's not much research done on what finches eat the budworm outbreaks of jack pines, but if it's similar to spruce budworm, yes, the winter finches will happily gorge themselves on that. Last year, we had a super flight. We had something that we haven't seen in generations. This is 10 years on the left-hand side, 10 years worth of eBird data of all evening grosbeak checklists. A few scattered, getting down into West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee. This is just one winter coming in. Big flocks were into the North Carolina mountains, all through Maryland. Birds even made it to Orlando. Last year, this big flight, the birds did something that surprised us. I thought they would move slowly on the way through, losing birds at different feeders here and there. However, they decided to move like lightning. We had 2 days where we had huge flocks coming through. Each diamond spot here is my house here east of Toronto. I had 150 come by my house one day. This downtown Toronto, they had over 400 in downtown Toronto. The Troy area here. These birds came streaming through here in basically 2 days, all heading into the Midwest. They didn't stop in Detroit. They headed down to southern Illinois, the Appalachians, and even to Arkansas on that. But they came down in big flocks, and they came down fast. This spot, Hollow Cliff, they had October 24th and 25th was their first pulse. On the east side of Lake Huron, they had 575 come by in one day. Meanwhile, on the North Shore Lake Erie, they had 900. We thought, wow, that's absolutely amazing. And then October 30th came by, where downtown Toronto, less than 2 miles away from the CN Tower and where the Maple Leafs play, 415 came pouring by during a hawk watch. And these three sites here on the North Shore of Lake Erie, north of Cleveland, this site here, Crawford, Kent, it's pretty much due north of Cleveland on the North Shore of Lake Erie. They had 1,347 evening grosbeaks come by in flock after flock, and not one of them stopped or stayed by. 2 days later, they couldn't find an evening grosbeak anywhere to be seen. They just all poured right out of Canada and went to the southwest. We haven't seen that in a generation. I had talked to some older birders and looked in the literature. This is the last time in Ontario where we had recorded flights like this. November 8th, 1969, 500 through Toronto. 1972, to the dates, October 24th, November 5th, 2,800 and 1,000. So basically, the birds last year came through almost the same period of this time. So if they do a big flight, they seem this is the time, the end of October, first week in November is when the big push is. But we had not seen this for 40 years. So we weren't expecting this. I was not expecting this. I was actually shocked watching them pour through. It was getting sad for us in Southern Ontario. We were watching all these lovely finches just fly by going, please stay, someone. But then a third wave came in slowly into December and stopped at some feeders for a while. This eruption here, you can see last year's map, came all the way down. They had birds into Arkansas on that. They had birds in, not an eBird, but a bird was at a feeder in Orlando. They had a couple more in northern Florida. First time they've seen them in decades in that state. But they all came pouring out of that area there as the source of most of eastern North America's evening grosbeaks right now. So I want to talk about one of our partners with Fern. The Finch Research Network, David Iney at the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and the Smithsonian Institute have developed a evening grosbeak working group here to try to monitor and track them. David has been doing for a multi-year winter study where he puts MODIS tag transmitters, MODIS towers, we put them up across North America where you put these little tags on the birds. If a bird flies within 4 or 5 miles, it'll trip the tower, will receive it, so you can track how these birds move. David's been doing this in Western Pennsylvania for several winters, and he finds that if you think you have the same evening grosbeaks coming to your feeder day after day, several times a day, there's a good chance you have multiple flocks. He'd be trapping them, banding them. They fly off. Next flock, they come in thinking it's going to be the same birds he banded. They're a whole different flock. He's finding like several bird flocks would be working one area, doing a circuit, coming back and forth. Like you may not see a bird you banded for 3 or 4 days because that flock went over 2 counties over for a few days. This is the source of many winter finches in the East. Everyone who's a big warbler fan has probably heard about the spruce budworm warblers, the Cape May warbler, the Tennessee warbler, and the bay-breasted warbler. Those 3 species have almost population explosions when spruce budworms have outbreaks because they just key in on this caterpillar and feed heavily on it. Instead of having a couple young, they have really big clutches and lots of young get born. A lot of parts of North America, we're seeing a lot more of those warblers. These 3 species, and to a lesser extent white-winged crossbills, key in heavily on spruce budworms during breeding season. Purple finches and evening grosbeaks, up to 80% of their diet is just spruce budworms during the breeding season. So when there's an outbreak, they'll move, more of the population moves to those outbreak areas, and they have big families. This is northeastern Ontario. This is what spruce budworms look like when they just start eating the tree. They eat all the new growth. In about 4 years, of this happening to primary balsam firs and white spruce. And if they can't eat that, then they'll start eating black spruce and tamarack and white pine. But balsam fir and white spruce are the favorites. After about 4 or 5 years of being denuded of all their new growth each year, the trees will die. This area here, taken last year in August, I went through this area this year, and a lot of these trees are turning brown and dying already. Spruce budworm outbreaks. When we had these huge evening grosbeak flocks that were everywhere, we had these absolute massive spruce budworm outbreaks. In 1980, we had 20 million hectares, 49 million.5 acres, like almost 50 million acres in Ontario alone in 1980 were infested with spruce budworms. Quebec has had worse ones. 79 million acres in 1975, when it was probably the biggest peak in Eastern North America, because not just Quebec had it, Ontario also had their outbreaks. Eastern provinces of Canada had outbreaks. Manitoba had some. So it was 129 million acres that year were under spruce budworm outbreaks of various, from intense where the trees are dying to where the trees have started to get losing their needles. So that was a lot of food for these finches for about 15, 20 years where they had their big population explosion. These are the 4, it should be, I'll talk about 3 in a second, outbreaks where the spruce budworms are really exploding in Eastern North America. Both these are growing. This one in the Gaspé Peninsula, north of New Brunswick and Maine, there's a lot of really old budworm outbreak area there. There's a lot of dead trees there. This one at 4 in Ontario, northeastern Ontario, and this one at 3 northwestern Quebec. I just got data Monday night. With latest data, where basically these 2 areas have actually joined up pretty much. So it's basically the outbreak's about that big right there. There's small pockets in Minnesota. There's more pockets here in northwestern Ontario, and there's small pockets. These little trees are some of the small pockets I found out last year, but there's many more showing up. Spruce budworms this year, they actually saw them on the radar when the moth started to fly. They actually had them in here on radar coming across the Gulf of St. Lawrence to Newfoundland. So that they can be highly migratory and dispersal with a great wind. Unfortunately for timber resources, they do have a devastating effect. During the first year of COVID, they didn't spray, but what they do now, they spray outbreak areas that were at high density near cities or near towns where there's lumber mills, to try to save as much timber resources as they can. What they spray is a bacteria spore, short form BTK, and it gets sprayed on the plants, and then the caterpillars ingest it. Unfortunately, butterflies and moth caterpillars, if they ingest it, they will die. But that's why they concentrate it in areas of really high spruce budworm, so mostly the spruce budworm's getting it, trying to get them in, the spores get in their gut, the bacteria get there, they change the way the guts, the caterpillars operate, so they starve to death. Also in areas of high density, there's a parasitic wasp that lays its eggs in the caterpillars. So these cycles grow up for about 40 years from trough to peak, and they kill most of the balsam firs in the area, disappear for another 20, 40 years, and then they rise again. It's a natural cycle. 2000, we were at basically the bottom. Now in Eastern North America, we're approaching the top. This is the hectares. You can see way there in 2001, 677 hectares low there of moderate. And way back here in 93 is only 477 total. Now, 2018, it was 8 million, 9 million, almost 10 million, 2019. 13.5 in 2020. In Quebec, it's over 50, it's close to 16 million hectares. Ontario, it's over 1 million hectares. It works out to be transferred acreage. Is currently the outbreak in Eastern Canada is about 40 million acres. So it's getting a fair size, and those winter finches, those 3 species, the white-winged crossbill a lesser degree, are absolutely enjoying this food source. Now on to future forecast goers. I would love to expand and actually recruit some people here, but expand the roster, particularly in the areas of low current representation. I have five reporters in the upper Midwest. I would love to get more. I love the diversity of people's views and what they see in the trees, help put a nice wider picture. I love the citizen science of anyone with a little bit of knowledge of trees or can eyeball cones, helps greatly. I like to increase the diversity of reporter background, more First Nations once COVID is gone, or more control of First Nation communities that are way up in the boreal forest that have access there, and more forestry professionals, naturalists, people going out for doing the bird atlasing stuff. This is not a science, it's an art. I take in what I can and try to paint this picture. The more people, more different backgrounds I find, the better. We're now at the Finch Research Network developing a document and an app where people can assist them at aging seeds, seeing what young cones are like, so they know generally what a bumper crop looks like, what a young tamarack, like young tamarack cone that's ripe for this year is more of a burgundy, a young black spruce is purple, white spruce is green, versus older brown cones. Make that so it's people can just sit there and get that information, assist them with that, and provide the information, hopefully the app in a timely way. One thing with the researcher, when Ron Pittaway developed this, and he did this for several years, I never saw him in August and September because he was chasing people, all of these reporters saying, okay, I need the information, and trying to synthesize this. These are the people, which this year's winter finch forecast, we say thank you to all the magnificent people who provide all the information. Without them, I would never be able to do any of this. They're the ones who go out there and nicely stop and stare at trees for me and give me various views. Some people give me professional scientific views. Other people just give me, I saw here, the spruce crop looks pretty good here. I saw my pine trees are looking pretty heavy. It gives a nice and wide view from coast to coast. This is the Finch Research Network. It was founded by Matt Young in 2020. I'm now become on the board of directors too. This is where the winter finch forecast has been out of the last 2 years. We sell winter flight shirts, some various other items. We're trying to fund as many finch research projects and some grad students as we can raise funds. We fund David Yeaney's Evening Grow Speaks with some notice tags. We're doing some work in Red Cross bills and helping to start up and hopefully fund rosy finches, because global warming and climate change is not doing well for birds that live on tops of mountains. So we're just second year, we're moving forward each year, so hopefully it becomes a bigger event. Feeder cameras. A lot of us have stuck inside in the cold winter or crappy weather. I, through COVID, started watching these. The one on the left is the Cornell feeder camera in northwestern Ontario. The one on the right is Algonquin Park in central Ontario, where it's about 120 evening growth peaks at right now. Feeder cameras, great way to watch past time when it's cold weather, but an interesting way where you can see finches coming to feeders. You can see some of the behavior and some of the spots, like there's feeder cameras all over the world. I watched this year bramblings, which is a pink and black finch that breeds in Scandinavia and Siberia, watch their explosive eruption out into Japan and into Western Europe on these feeder cameras. I could see them in Scandinavia at people's feeders, and then they big numbers and they just disappeared. And then I could see them feeders in other parts of Europe all of a sudden just show up all over the place. So it's interesting things, and there's feeders all over the world, so you can have some great time passing that. I made a joke. This is a Pallas's roses finch from Japan. I was there in early 2020. I made a joke last year that at the end of my talk saying, yes, you will not see this finch. I predict 99.9999% this won't show up in North America. Thinking, okay, these Asian finches stay there. And then in end of December 2020 till last spring, this is a hawfinch. This is the first Canadian record of this Asian, and European finch that showed up. I wasn't expecting this anywhere in Canada, and it decided to surprise me. So you never know what may show up at your feeder, because finches do like to roam. When they go for a fly, they like to go for a long fly. And thank you very much for having me for your talk. I greatly enjoyed speaking for you and spreading the information on finches.
Thank you so much, Tyler. I've got a few questions. A couple have come through from the Q&A. Most of them are about the webinar. So if you've got any other questions, I know I've added a couple, but if you've got questions, go ahead, type them into the Q&A there. We'll definitely be sharing the recording. So those were most of the questions that I have right now. But if you've got questions for Tyler about the talk, let's go ahead, type them in right now into the Q&A box there or into the chat. And I've got a question for you, Tyler.
Okay.
Right away. You were talking a little bit about sort of it seemingly is simple to my mind for the seed eaters, since those finches are basically the only things that are taking advantage of the seed crops besides, like, you know, red-breasted nuthatch or something like that. But frugivores, I can imagine they're a little bit harder to predict, because you have robins and Swainson's thrush and hermit thrush and solitaires and all kinds of these other birds working through those food crops. So is there a different sort of methodology predicting a frugivore flight versus a seed eater flight?
Ron developed it as the same way. I'm still working with it the same way, because once you get down away from mountain ash, you got a lot of berries that are in the shrubs, and it gets more difficult for people to speciate the different species of dogwoods and all that. But yeah, frugivores, yeah, I learned last year the hard way about the bulldozing robins and Swainson's thrushes. Sitting there 2 hours north of my house, there was a good mountain ash crop. I went up there in mid-October, and the robins were heavily in there, and Swainson's thrushes that were still coming through were in there picking everything clean. And learned about bears and mountain ash this year when I was going through the boreal forest with my daughter. I took her up for a week of daddy-daughter trip throughout northern Ontario, northwestern Quebec, looking at trees. I don't think she's going to do it again, but learned that the bears were, if they can't get ground berries, they will happily go up in the mountain ash trees and snap the branches and take them down. So, yeah, frugivores can be a lot harder, especially really big nomads like Bohemian waxwings.
Sure, sure. I think we've got a new question for you here. Oh, so here's a good question that is a great one for everybody to know here. So where can you go to report when you see these birds and where you see these birds?
eBird is probably the easiest way to put them in. It is such a huge, diverse, worldwide bird observation network. And you can put them in, and your recordings for most of your records can come up in real time into the maps are updated a couple times a day too. So it's a great source. And also, I don't know if Sax-Zim has a local listserv or something where you can put up where you've seen these species. But yeah, most of the big information during the winter we get from off eBird. But if you're a finch reporter, cone crop reporter, my last question when I asked you what you see on my list is, what finches are you seeing?
Thank you. Awesome. Yeah, eBird's a super reference. They produced really nice maps for folks like us who are doing talks about things, but it's a really easy to use a resource that is immensely helpful, especially for folks who can't cover one coast to the other in a season to see what's going on. So it's really, really wonderful. Another question, is it possible to download or print a copy of the finch to seed type preference chart?
Yes, it is in, where to get it? I do believe it's either Audubon or Cornell did, a couple years ago, they did an article on Ron Pittaway. And in their article, they had that chart. And that's why I admit where I took it from.
Awesome. Perfect. Perfect. Other questions? We've still got a couple of minutes. If there are a few other questions that are.
Oh, what? Last year in Minnesota, you guys had a big push of of white-winged crossbills in mid-October.
Yeah.
Yeah. What the theory we have is in Kenora, dry in northwestern Ontario, 3 days beforehand, there was a major freezing rain event. And it didn't really warm up before those white-winged crossbills showed up. We think a lot of those crossbills came out of that area because they couldn't get to the cones. They were just frozen under ice. So when you see over the winter and early spring, when you see freezing rain events, they're a good way to drive finches out of the area or drive them to your area.
Super interesting. Oh, I never would have thought about freezing rain and its effects on cones.
Yeah. Freezing rain and ice is one of the worst things for a lot of winter finches and owls.
Yeah, totally. Just an observation question. Pine grosbeaks in my yard in Ely, Minnesota, seem to prefer the crab apples versus the mountain ash. Is that something that you're seeing elsewhere too, or is it a general food type?
Finding a lot when they go down a lot into the villages and all that, they seem to love the ornamental crab apples, yes, over the mountain ash. But the ornamental crab apples they seem to love the most are those, I think they call them fire crest or fire something crab apples. They're a brighter red. Well, I've noticed if those trees are around in a town, that is where you go for your pine grosbeaks first. Yeah,
awesome.
They will happily, if it's a nice crab apple, they will happily take that over the local mountain ash.
Awesome. Excellent. Other question. Let's see. So this is again just a reminder of the Finch in the Food Show. That was from an interview that Cornell did with Ron Pittaway. Was that correct?
It's either Cornell or Audubon, one of the two.
Okay.
Right offhand. I don't have it right offhand.
Perfect. No worries. No worries. Other questions or notes or observations, or are we getting any volunteers to be cone watchers from this little talk? I know a few folks up in Ely that might be interested, and I know I'll definitely mention it to master naturalist groups. It was a super easy thing to do, to go out and just look at trees for a whole day. That was a pretty cool day to get to. I just
greatly appreciate all your information there. It was very nice. Like the wild card last year was how far the drought came east into Minnesota and Ontario. And your information helped a lot to figure out it got patchy, the cone crops were different.
Yeah. Because
northwest of you, the berries shriveled up and the cones were just poor right across the board.
Yeah.
Just across the border.
Here's another interesting question. So obviously with all these birds moving around, working on cones and things, is there a good way that you might suggest sort of to provide water for these birds in the winter? Is there one way better than the other?
Just trying to keep it warm and try to not keep it frozen. Yes, they love it taking water if it's near a food source. If you can have it, your heated water bath or running water bath, what do you have? Try to have it closer to the shrubs so they don't have to come so far out in the open. They'll utilize that more. And one thing I've been trying this year, I found works wonders at my house. It's not for the water, but for bringing the finches in. A lot of the county roads around here, they've been doing the brushing in late fall. And there's a lot of, their cuttings on the side of the road there in the ditch. And have picked up some alder bushes with lots of seed on them, put them in my backyard, and the juncos and goldfinches and a couple purple finches have been on them heavily. They turned right away from my feeder, went right after those alder seeds that were on the branches I put in the backyard.
Very interesting. And now you'll have a nice little alder hedgerow the next summer. It'll be great.
Oh, hopefully.
All right, let's take one last question if we've got it out there from folks. Give it a couple of seconds here. While we're waiting, I really it was a good note that you had for red crossbill, because that was sort of our big surprise, at least with Christmas bird counts, is that we had far more red crossbill than white-winged crossbill, and considering reds hardly moved during the fall and we had all these big crossbill or white-winged crossbill and redpoll flights, it was a huge surprise that we had far more reds in town than we did with white-wings. But it sort of makes sense if they're going to stick around and they found the food right away. Those red crossbills, they just sort of stuck it out. They didn't have to go anywhere.
Yeah, they were here for the white pine, and they went, oh, look what's here, right? I can do this. They're very nice how they painted the food belt for me before I even looked at it. I was like, oh, you guys are already here. The white-winged crossbills, I'm an eBird reviewer for my county in Ontario. And in July, I started getting some people reporting white-winged crossbills, like, okay, that's really odd. Then I started talking to some Finch forecasters, Macomb people in Northern Ontario. They're like, yeah, they're just coming through in big numbers, all heading east.
All right, we've got 2 evening grosbeak questions. So I said we had one more question, but we're going to do 2 because they're both evening grosbeak related. So this question reads, we've been seeing and hearing for years about the decline of evening grosbeaks. Is it not necessarily a concern, but just instead a natural reaction to spruce budworm?
This is the tough one. They are having a long-term decline. If you take out the big hump in the 80s, late 70s and 80s, when they had a big population explosion, it's a gentle slope downwards. If you keep that in your data, it's a much steeper decline because they exploded that way. But now they're starting to curve up. How long, excuse me, the Eastern Canada budworm outbreaks keep growing is how high they're going to rise back up again. But I find with these outbreaks, at least in Northern Ontario, when it was low population spruce budworms, evening grosbeaks, I could find them all over the place, but 1s and 2s here and there. It almost seems like a huge part of this population is keyed in on these outbreaks and have moved there for their summer homes. But yeah, they're on the increase, but with COVID's kind of stopped a lot of research going out into the field to actually try to track these numbers properly.
Sure. And I think that last part answered my other question that I had about that. So again, that cyclic nature of the budworm populations has a lot to do with that sort of movement, especially of evening grosbeaks out of areas into areas with budworm outbreaks.
All you can eat buffets, easy to raise for kids.
Excellent. Well, thank you everybody for the questions, and Tyler, thank you so much. This was a lovely talk to hear about the process and how this happens and how it happens that we get to enjoy a lot of these finches most of the winters. And so we'll keep watching them and we'll keep enjoying them, and hopefully we'll get a few more folks to help you out with your endeavors, really reporting some cones for you.
That would be great. Thank you very much for having me.
You're very welcome. And thanks everybody for attending tonight. This was a really lovely start to the season. I look forward to our other 2 talks the rest of the season as well.